So welcome everybody. My name is Jeff Hergert. I'm an account executive for FireEye and very excited to moderate a panel discussion focused on XDR in a MythBuster style format. And just in the spirit of trying to put some energy into this session and get a lot of audience participation, we are offering up a $100 gift card to the person voted on by the panel who is the most engaging, whether it's with questions, commentary, whatever have you. So how can you engage as an audience member if as we go through the myths in the MythBuster style format? Feel free to comment in the comment section, raise your hand, just even jump in and feel free to comment. We really want you to weigh in why we think these myths can either be confirmed, plausible, or busted. So yeah, I think we see 23 people on the line. Hopefully that we get some good commentary. But before we begin, I want to go around the horn and get some introductions from the panel. So I don't know who wants to go first. If see Brian, you ready?
Yeah, absolutely. Hello, good day, everyone. My name is Brian Brown. I'm an enterprise architect with McAfee Enterprise. Been with the organization for about 14 years. But I do have a history and a past outside the dark side of sales, representing a company. I was an operations manager and security information architect at a consortium of 5 hospitals in downtown Toronto at one point in my career. Really welcome your participation today, and thanks for joining us.
Name's George Azari. I'm a consulting system engineer for FireEye, cover the western half of Canada. Been with FireEye Canada for the last 3 years, been with FireEye for the last 8 years, and very excited about using XDR in different environments. So definitely want to keep this active. We're going to tell you, myths, non-myths, plausible. We'll all have our own decisions and our own insights on it. But we definitely want to hear from you guys. To add some more flavor. Do you want to invest, not invest? Still need more information? I put a poll up. Just to see, what you guys know about XDR already.
I'm Richard Baker, the founder and CEO of Our Solutions, a cybersecurity firm out of Regina, Saskatchewan, with folks all across Canada. Been in security over 21 years now. First 11 years, actually maybe about 9 years on the client side of the house. A couple years at a Big Four consulting company, and then 11 years running Our Solutions. So happy to be here.
Awesome. No, thanks, folks. Just going to put up a little bit of material here to keep us on track here. 1 second. Why can't I see this? Sorry, come up. So, can everybody see my screen here? We're all ready to go?
You bet.
Yeah, so before we get to the myths, I wanted to talk about why are we talking about XDR? I think everybody's gotten probably 1,000 emails in their inbox from vendors about invest in XDR and here's why. But I think it's important to walk through some of the challenges that we're hearing from our clients. Why people are interested in XDR. So we'll just quickly go through 4. I don't think any of this is really earth-shattering, but I think it's important to highlight. The first is just the increased complexity of people's environments and what they're up against. Right. I think that there's a lot of organizations that are moving to SaaS models. People have more and more tools, security controls at their disposal, lots of dashboards and reporting, and it's hard to get a lot of information, I guess, understand all the information coming at you as a security practitioner. The other thing is resource constraints. I mean, again, it's no surprise the workloads as a security professional are increasing, but the resources ability to actually do the work are, not able to keep up. So, I think there's a lot of burnout in the industry, and we can't always get to everything that we'd like to during the day. The changing threat landscape. There's lots of silver bullet tools out there, lots of vendors claiming that they can solve the world's problem, but Interestingly enough, there's more and more breaches every year. There's more and more ransomware attacks, more and more 0 days, more and more headlines. I think speaking with a CIO a few days ago, he said when he talking to the board, he said we always knew security was important, but given the recent headlines, it's really at the forefront. So, and then the last one, just the point tools, right? We're, again, kind of reiterating what I said before, but there's you guys as security practitioners have lots of different tools at your disposal. But a lot of things are siloed between reporting, dashboards, and everything else. So lots of challenges as a security practitioner. And again, before we get to the myths, I just wanted to set a baseline for definitions of XDR. And again, I think if you were to ask 5 security practitioners what XDR means, you'll probably get 6 different answers back. But what we've done is we've taken some definitions as defined by some third-party independent analyst communities, so the likes of the Gartner's, IDCs, and whatnot. So 2 different definitions I'll just roll through, just again set a baseline, and then we'll get into the myths and look to either confirm, either have them as plausible or busted. So the first definition, an integrated suite of security products spanning hybrid IT architectures, designed to interoperate and coordinate on threat prevention, detection, and response, unifies control points, security telemetry, analytics, and operations into one enterprise system. That's one definition. And the second, kind of similar, but a SaaS-based security threat detection and incident response tool that natively integrates endpoint, network, email, cloud, and third-party security into a cohesive security operations system. So, is just checking with the panel. Any thoughts on those first definitions? You guys, are we all in agreement there?
So Jeff, I just wanted to comment. I looked up XDR this morning on Google, and it came back with 1.2 billion results. So we're definitely going to help out and clarify, get it down to like 1 to 2. But this is a great primer.
Okay, awesome. Any comments from Brian or Richie?
Good level set, Jeff. I think there's varying viewpoints. Let's put it that way. So it's a good time for us to be coming together and talking about this because there isn't one cohesive agreement about what XDR really is. And I'm sure Richie, with his experience, he sees things from a different lens on the world, and so hopefully everyone's going to get a little bit of a multiple set of perspectives throughout the discussion today.
Awesome. No, thank you, Brian. All right, this is where we're really hoping for some audience participation here. So again, if there are questions, comments, let's raise your hand, put something in the chat window. We really want to hear from you. Ready for the first myth?
Bring it on.
XDR is a replacement of SIM and/or SOAR. What our solutions, I'll hand this over to Richie first. Our solutions, you guys do a ton of work in the SIM and SOAR world. Richie, what are your thoughts?
I'm going to say that no, I don't believe XDR is a replacement of SIM and SOAR in all cases. There are many use cases that people have SIMs for compliance, log retention, which kind of differ from what the nature of what XDR is supposed to deliver when it comes to the aggregation of data analytics and correlating between the different security controls. Similarly, on the response side, it's not a SOAR tool per se, and so I don't think it necessarily negates the need for SOAR. But in some cases where clients, just want to have better understanding from these multitude and voluminous logs that are coming in about what's important to look at, don't have other compliance things, could in certain situations it be a replacement? Sure, in some, but I don't think holistically we can say that XDR is a replacement for SIM and SOAR. Now, selfishly, I would say, is it advantageous to have more automation in correlating disparate technologies to make SOCs more efficient? Absolutely. But as a full replacement, I don't believe it is in 100% of the cases, but in isolated situations, maybe.
Okay. No, great response. So you're saying busted. Brian, George, any comments? Any questions from the crowd? Comments from the audience?
I would say, XDR is a part. I mean, SIM and SOAR are part of an XDR solution. They won't replace it. If you already have all that data in a SIM, let's use it. If it's already gathering there, using SOAR to help with the response that XDR finds, I would definitely use that to your advantage. So I wouldn't say this is 100% busted. I don't say 100% true though.
Go ahead, Brian.
I was just going to say I generally agree with George. I think of XDR as a capability, of which SIM and SOAR are potentially components of that capability. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to replace either one of them, but when you look at that lack of consensus about what XDR really is, I think there are different perspectives on this. But can SIM augment or help or enrich what you're doing within XDR? Sure. Can SIM be part of the workflows that you're implementing as part of in a SOC environment that you want to build upon with XDR? Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think just looking at a couple of the comments online, like Kyle said, does that mean XDR is limited to SIM only? No, not at all. Like XDR is really, like Brian said, a set of capabilities of which that, correlating the disparate security controls is just one of. I mean, the concept of least privilege, instead of a trust but verify but trust. And those get implemented in numerous security controls. So no, not definitely limited only to SIM. However, I think we do see a number of vendors out there, and everyone has their own opinion about, here's my product, space XDR. And many of those have been more on the correlating side of the house. But just similarly, you'd have a lot of the identity management vendors and micro segmentation vendors and a number of others claiming this is their contribution towards XDR.
Great. Any other comments, questions from the audience before we move on?
There was a question here, Angelo said, do we have any examples of implementing XDR solutions in an OT environment? I think if you go back to the XDR is not one technology. It is a number of concepts that in some ways, yes. Micro segmentation, network access control, many of those technologies have been implemented in OT environments. Even some of the escalating authorization and identity systems are completely compatible. So yes, parts and pieces, but I don't know that any one organization, even on the corporate side, can say we have XDR everywhere because it's not one thing.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, Richie. Specific to an OT environment, there are considerations such as air gapping that come into play, and other considerations that make that somewhat unique compared to a traditional corporate IT deployment. But that doesn't mean you can't do XDR. I mean, we have experience with customers who have been running many of the components that you'll see in an XDR architecture, some degree of threat protection, threat intelligence, and maybe they're not connecting directly to the outside. Maybe there's a process to get that data into the OT environment and use it there. But hunting and mining for OT environment specific indicators, looking across the network for Modbus communication and things like that in a SIM, and executing a response with a potentially localized version of an EDR technology, all those things kind of come into play. So I think you could make the argument that in a limited way, you can have an XDR environment in OT, bringing in localized network IPS sensors and telemetry, and building out that framework that is in that OT specific environment. It can be done, and I think there are a lot of good examples where organizations have already taken steps in that respect. Maybe it's not tied in with their corporate IT environment. That doesn't mean that you can't do XDR there.
Great. Well, guys, just in the sake of time, we have 7 more myths to get through. So I'm going to say this one is plausible, just based on the comments from Brian and George and Richie. So yeah, we'll move on to number 2. XDR requires using all security products from a single vendor. Boy, as working at FireEye, I'd love that to be true if it, vendor chooses all FireEye, but Brian, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think there are a lot of different perspectives on this, but from my viewpoint, is there potentially value of having a good set of technologies from one vendor? Probably there is. I'd like to think that vendors know their technologies well and they've done a good job of making them work in an integrated and cohesive fashion. But, look, let's be honest about this. Security is a team sport, and there are always processes that are going to be touched by XDR, whether we're talking just the detection response or whether we're talking about the actual incident response post that are likely going to include things that are not in every vendor's portfolio. So I don't think you could have something in XDR ultimately that is reliant 100% on one vendor. I think there's a key aspect of some degree of openness, and whether that's through API connectivity or other native integration methods, we won't discuss that here. I think you can look to a vendor for a value prop that has a lot of components, but I think you're probably going to want to look at things that also have a degree of openness to them as well.
Oh, great response. Richie, George, any other further comments?
So Jeff, you took my answer. For being on the sales side, yes, I like it to be all one. But if somebody comes to you and as Brian says, it's a capability. So if you're buying an XDR solution, you want to make sure that it works with stuff already in your current environment. Multiple vendors. And just going forward, if it's only one vendor, I do not know a vendor out there that covers every single aspect of a network for protection. So since there isn't a vendor that does that, I would have to say, you have to go multi-vendor.
Okay. Well, I think we can easily say this one is busted. So let's move on to number 3 here. Using XDR will increase the effectiveness of your security staff. I know, George, you work with many security operation teams across Western Canada. What are your thoughts here?
So whenever you add a tool or a capability to your security stack, hopefully it makes it better. If it doesn't make it better, it's a bad tool or a bad product. So using XDR, what does XDR gives you a view of everything that's happening in your environment? So I would have to say, yes, it would increase the effectiveness just because you're now seeing, a better picture of your environment.
I got to add, I'm going to say yes, but only if configured properly and working as designed. I mean, the effectiveness, increasing the effectiveness, that was the promise of SOAR. That's the promise of a well-configured SIM platform that has correlations across, disparate tool sets. So I think, to be honest with you, the conceptually, and that's actually kind of what it's built for, sure. But I think you have to take into consideration, is it actually configured properly and implemented right for your environment? And regardless of what vendors include in, for their pre-built stuff, these all take investments. There's no silver bullet to a lot of this. And so it does take that tuning and configuring the system relative to your environment, which often means you have to understand your environment in the first place to a degree that you can actually tune these systems relevant for yourself. So I'm going to say my final answer is yes, but with those caveats.
Brian, anything to add?
Yeah, and look, ultimately, this is the desire, or one of the desirable outcomes from XDR, is to increase your visibility, your detection response capability, to shorten dwell time, to shorten time cycles, to make things easier, make processes easier. So hopefully, I agree with Richie that this is the ultimate outcome, or one of them certainly from XDR. But I do think that it takes a lot of thought to be able to get to that end state. And
Yes.
Whether an organization decides to implement XDR themselves, or like many, you turn to to a company like what our solutions offers. There's some degree of looking at what is a realistic capability for the staff, and making that evaluation about where XDR is actually going to help. So that it is effective. Too many tools can also increase complexity, as everybody is well aware of. And Jeff, you hit upon that resource crunch in security that we're all very familiar with. It has to be done in the right way to get to that level of effectiveness, and then it will deliver on the goal for you.
But Brian, you touched on a really good point there, because when you look at the breadth of tools that XDR is kind of encompassing of, when you look at the identity, the network, the microsegmentation, all the things on the control side of the house before detection and response happens, that does add a lot of complexity. And so when something doesn't work, how do you figure out why it's not working? And so in some ways, it is adding complexity in multiple other parts of the network before you can even get to the efficiency side of the detection and response. The hope is that by putting these other controls in, we also reduce the attack surface and make it harder for incidents to happen in the first place. But yeah, there is that weigh scale between complexity and efficiency, and then manageability and detection capabilities.
Yeah. And some great questions that I see coming up in the chat. One from Angelo: are we including programmers and developers? And Greg asks, is XDR's effectiveness limited by the organization's cybersecurity maturity and competencies? And I think that's, those two really hit upon one of the major concerns that we hear around XDR, right? If we think about this as a SOC-centric capability, again, not just a technology, but a capability, and you look at detection response, well, that response especially is an area where you might have to involve multiple teams. You might have to go back to the development team who was pushing out code into your cloud environment in their CI/CD pipeline, and they become integral to that R part of XDR. And both of those questions really speak to who is involved in XDR, and I think that has expanded the scope of what we see, the SOC kind of touch points and the recognition that we have to reach out to other parts of the organization who might not be directly responsible for what we see in the SOC, but maybe they're part of the entire value chain that we're trying to address. And yeah, do we need a maturity model? Well, regardless of whether or not an organization has a maturity model, I think it's a question of building up that capability over time so that we do hit the right people at the right point in the workflow when we're doing things like a response. So it's not a one size fits all. It's working it into existing processes and being very cognizant of where the who in the response is actually going to be responsible for executing that response action.
Yeah, just to respond to Greg's question about the maturity as well too. I think one of the things that we've implemented hundreds of SIM systems for clients across North America, and I don't think XDR is any different. So your question about does the level of maturity of the client matter? Well, in the aspect of what is the controls that are feeding the XDR or SIM platforms, if you have and I'm not going to say any names, but if you have an endpoint tool that doesn't send any logs because it doesn't detect anything, it doesn't matter what your XDR or SIM is because it doesn't have the data it needs to actually even evaluate. And so the maturity is at least required that the network, endpoint, email, and other parts of the environment that are critical have the appropriate security controls so that they have logs and data to send to any one of these systems. Should be the focus and priority first before SIMs and XDR. So from that level of maturity, absolutely, there is kind of an order of precedence that makes sense. Putting XDR in before you have those other things down is definitely important to take care of. And to Kyle, how is this different from SIM? I would say it this way, and trust me, I've thought about this lots because I think a well-configured SIM tool would have elements of XDR in it already based on the searches. But somebody had explained once to me, XDR, you can look at XDR as in one version of looking at it is take the 100 questions you would ask of any data and being able to ask those 100 questions on every piece of data that comes in, not just when you've got an event or something else. And so it's taking all of that knowledge, which may be multiple queries. So I saw, and this was vendor, they took one XDR kind of finding and said, how many searches would it have taken in the SIM to get the result? And they figured it was about 128 searches. Well, obviously there's a time to do that, and it's very difficult to automate that and at scale. Most SIM platforms couldn't handle that on every piece of data coming in. And so that's where XDR is kind of taking a different approach, using some of all the marketing terms, machine learning and modeling and everything else to try and do this effectively at scale. So elements of SIM are in there, but I think it's definitely an evolution from just SIM. But once again, most of the time in most organizations, I look at this as an addition or an enhancement to SIM, not a replacement to SIM for the mid to large enterprises.
Okay. I love the questions coming in and keep them coming, but just in the sake of time, we're going to keep going on because we got 5 more myths to get through. But yeah, I think we should confirm, but with some caveats as to Richie's comments here. Myth 4, XDR will provide visibility across multiple threat vectors. Let's see, who wants to go first on this one?
Well, since nobody's jumping up, I guess I will. One of the main things that XDR does give you is that visibility. It starts correlating between your endpoint, your email, your network. So I would say definitely it would provide visibility across multiple threat vectors.
No, makes sense. I think this is probably one of the easier ones, right? I mean, I think XDR is an evolution of EDR, XDR. X stands for extended, so I think we're pretty safe to say this one's confirmed, guys.
Agreed.
Myth 5, XDR requires intelligence feeds to be effective. And George, you've been working with the Mandiant group for 6-7+ years now. Mandiant's known for some of the best intelligence out there. What are your thoughts here?
So you need some intelligence. I mean, if you just look at a regular log file with no intelligence, it's just text on the screen. No matter what type of tools you put at it, the more intelligence you have, the better data you're going to get out. The old adage, garbage in, garbage out. So if you don't have any good intelligence or don't have any intelligence, you're not going to get valuable stuff on the other end of it. So adding additional feeds will definitely make it a lot more effective.
Yeah, and I'll just add to what George was saying. Look, I don't think any security program is going to be effective without some degree of intelligence feeds. And obviously that's going to vary. It's going to vary based on the size of the staff. It's going to vary based on the tooling that's used in the SOC or the SOC-like environment. It might be just one person who's managing security. And so, it's critical to have the outside perspective, to have threat intel as part of your security program. I don't think there's really much dispute that you need that. This is really a bigger question of how does it play into the effectiveness of detection and response, and can it be consumable in such a way that you can add your own feeds, you can add other intelligence sources rather than just what one vendor provides, and gain additional context. That to me is where the capability of XDR I think overlaps very much with intelligence in general. I take the perspective that more is better, but intelligence does also have to be managed. It has to be curated. It has to make sense in the context of your org. Intelligence for just intelligence sake doesn't add a lot of value. And good or effective XDR capability will use intelligence that is locally relevant and is going to make the tool or make the capability more effective overall, for sure.
So Brian, I want to add to one thing. You brought up something terrific there. If you have an XDR solution and you have every single intelligent feed that's out there coming in there, you're just going to overwhelm your staff. I would say add the intelligence feeds that, kind of fit the maturity level of your SOC or your security team. Because if you give them too much information, they might be very intrigued by it and, just go down that rat hole and going, oh, what is this? And, their effectiveness, goes out the door. But, I would add the feeds as your SOC matures, as they can handle the better stuff to help them. Just don't overwhelm them, because we already know they got a couple fire hoses already. We don't need to give them another one.
Yeah.
And I wanted to comment too, Angela, you had a question on how do you report the value? That's a very good question, because there's a couple ways of looking at it. One, you can see how much more free time, your security staff has. You can look at the, how fast are we able to correlate? If you're able to correlate in a couple minutes using XDR compared to hours that a security analyst would take, I would be looking at the amount of time and the number of incidents or alerts that a person could go through to start measuring, XDR.
Or even how quickly can we execute a response? Has the XDR capability given us the ability to say, look, we went from manual processes where the SOC had to call somebody up and say, what do you see on your console? How can you action a response? Okay, get back to me once this is done. If we can make that capability be part of the workflow in the tool and measure the time from the response action being initiated to closure, and maybe that includes a ticketing system for an ITSM environment as well, then we can actually measure something out that gives metrics back that say, manual process, it took us 24 hours to do this before, and now it only takes us, hopefully a lot shorter period of time, whatever that is.
Cool.
Yeah, I would just add in the return on investment is always one of the most difficult things in security, because even when we take a look at XDR specifically, part of the goal of XDR is to find things that others didn't see because you're bringing other pieces of data together. So in that way, it's partly intended to actually identify things that a singular security control isn't able to identify. But just like the others have said, mean time to resolution, the time it takes, in different incident types, when it comes to the response side, measuring how much is automated from even data enrichment and case enrichment versus what would have had manually, all can be used to report, an ROI on making an XDR investment.
Some great questions. Any other questions or comments before we move on? No. Okay, so myth 5 is confirmed. Myth 6, XDR is a made-up term by vendors to sell more products. I love this one. I'd actually love to hear from the audience before we throw it over to maybe to Richie. Richie he speaks to vendors, all sorts of vendors on the regular basis. But I'd love to hear the audience's feedback. Any comments? I'll give it to Richie. Richie, what do you think? You talk to all sorts of vendors. What do you think this is? Legit?
Yeah, I don't know if they made it up. Usually, academia tends to, define the terms, and then eventually vendors pick up. And now whether they make a brand new product or whether they retool some existing products that they have, I think you can find when you search for XDR. You can find a number of different vendors that say they have XDR, some net new, some not. And going back to even what some of the commentary was before, some of the vendors that offered platform solutions were doing elements of XDR already when things are acting and actually working together in different parts of the security controls. But have the vendors picked up on XDR and figure that they can sell a product with it? Yes, I'm sure you're going to have XDR flavored iced tea or lemonade here right away that somebody's going to try and sell. So yes, I do think the vendors pick it up as a marketing term and exploit it. But do I think there's some real value into the concepts behind XDR? Yeah, I do.
Yeah, and Kyle in the comments or the chat brought up, it seems more of a marketing than a brand new innovations. Just a bundled way of saying the same thing. And you know what? Look, even representing a vendor as I do, is it a term that's made up by vendors or made up by the industry? Probably yes. Let's just be transparent about this. And I agree with Kyle's assessment that it's a bundling. And when you think of any capability that spans, multiple technologies, multiple products, multiple different parts of your environment, exactly that. It is a bundling. But that's why I think of it as that capability. Is the industry capitalizing on this thing as XDR? Yeah, but to me, that's the evolution of security, right? And as we go on in time and things begin to work better together more effectively, one of the good things or positions that I hope everyone in the audience really takes is that if we can actually define to some degree what XDR is and the values that it's shooting for, then you know what? It gives those people a metric to be able to measure and understand whether or not something is going to work better for them, right? It might help with vendor selection. It might help with capability. It helps you determine whether or not it's something that's really going to be useful for you. Because, as we all of us have said, just throwing out technology is not necessarily going to make it effective. It has to work for you.
Did we lose Brian? Just me. Oh.
In that process, I think it's going to be ultimately beneficial.
Yeah, I think Brian's having a little communication problem.
Okay.
You're cutting in and out a bit, Brian, but that's all right.
Sorry about the connection there, everybody.
No problem. George, Richie, I don't know if you guys want to comment on this, but Brian did some great comments. Great questions, Scott.
Well, the last thing I'll say is, to me, XDR, I almost look at it as the automation of what a good SOC and security analysts have been trying to do manually and with their brains and intelligence. It's just trying to find a more efficient way to do it. But is it anything brand new? No. So.
Okay. Well, with that, we'll say busted.
Yep. Adam in the comment had a great one. Focus on the outcome. Love that.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks, Adam. Myth 7, XDR requires an endpoint. Does it absolutely 100% require an endpoint? What are the thoughts here? What do you think? Maybe throw it back to you, Brian. You've worked with all sorts of organizations across Canada and all sorts of different types of environments. Do we need it?
Could you do XDR without an endpoint? Sure, you could. You could look at network telemetry and cloud telemetry and combine that with aspects of threat intelligence and some other log data that you're collecting from your SIM for enrichment. But realistically, when you look at the way that most attacks unfold, where do they emanate from? I'm not saying everything, this is always the case, but the bulk of large attacks do have a device or an endpoint component. And without that telemetry, I think you're missing a lot of the richness that would be necessary to get to a good detection and response scenario. So does it require an endpoint? I think realistically, we have to say yes. Could you do it without an endpoint? You could, but I think you'd really be missing a lot of valuable information that makes XDR really what it is.
So I just wanted to comment one thing on there. Brian, you're 100% correct on, where do most attacks begin? Although everybody says 80+% come through email, but it's the person who clicks on the email on the endpoint that really causes the infection. So if you have your email coming in and then your endpoint's there to, actually say what happened, I would say, again, yes, you can do it without, but it's a really nice tool to have. Having a car without wheels, you still have a car, but you're not going to go through.
Yeah, I mean, us as consultants going into companies and representing multiple vendors is kind of one of those answers. Technically, yeah, could you? But you'd be crazy not to have your endpoint data in your XDR solution.
Okay. We'll say pretty much confirmed, but we'll say plausible based on, I like George's comment. You can have a car without wheels, but so last myth here. Here we go. And how are we doing for time? We got 10 minutes left, so we could say 5 minutes left for a little bit of audience conversation. But myth 8, the R is in this response can be completely automated. So the R in XDR, does it need to be completely automated? Like, maybe another way to phrase this, is there a human element involved? So I don't know, Richie, again, I'll go back to you, right? I mean, you run a SOC, implemented all sorts of SOAR and SIM solutions. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the utopia is that things can be monitored or completely automated in a response, and maybe for certain use cases you can, but I think it's definitely a goal and a panacea, and we're nowhere close to that yet. It's the same reason we don't automate nuclear missile launches. There's some things that can happen that can have negative consequences, even as simple as quarantining a wrong system, a critical system. And I'm not even talking about on our OT environment, even in a corporate type environment. So while I think it's a goal, I think really the reality is using the automation where applicable to minimize the response time and get a faster MTTR, but the complete automation goal, but not there yet.
And I think you have to take into consideration the scope of what R really means, right? And as we were talking about before, how many teams are involved? There might be in specific environments gating controls that need a human component, that need approval before we actually execute the response action. And so you can't say that everything is always going to be completely automated. I think there's a lot of opportunity for automation. And I think with something that creates a better workflow between a bunch of today what are disparate products, XDR will help in that respect. But I don't think you can ever say that XDR is always going to completely automate everything that you're doing out of the SOC and across all the teams. It really depends on asset criticality, who's involved, what is the appropriate response at the right time. But the good part is you get a framework that you can work with to do as much of that as possible.
I like the comments. There's comments about Skynet and automatic. But I think the reality is kind of similar to what Cal's comment is. Like, we will get certain amounts of data and response, automated data enrichment, and then push it back to the intelligent analyst saying, here's a couple options we recommend. I think that's the level that we're starting to see in some of the more mature clients, with the reality being even some of the largest, and this isn't even XDR, even the largest SOAR deployments have had limited automation on the actual response, more automation in case management and data enrichment into the case to make the analyst faster.
And we even see, levels of criticality, right? So as more data is brought in, we can get a level of confidence. And out of that confidence, we can say, now we've met a threshold. And so we're going to go and do something right away, right? There's a severity or criticality that comes into play that in the situation, if we know there's a data exfil event, we want to lock it down. Now, maybe the scope of that is just one individual endpoint, and so there's limited exposure. But you can put in some of those things where you say, based on these conditions, yeah, we want to automate because that is the best way to keep us safe. In other scenarios, it might be, well, you know what? We got to bring the human into the loop a little bit more and put it into a holding pattern until the right decisions can be made.
Sorry for laughing there. I just read Adam's final part of the meat bags are still required. I'm not sure if I can go back to my SOC and call them meat bags right now. We're probably going to they'll call me the CEO punching bag, but I love it.
The future is bright as a security practitioner is what you're saying, right? We're not going to be out of jobs anytime soon.
No, I don't think there's enough. The concept of XDR automating response, we need it because there's not enough of us. So I don't think anybody in the security industry should be afraid of this automating our jobs and us going out because let's face it, there isn't enough of us. There's not enough time to do the stuff we want to do now. So let's automate the stuff that is task-based, that doesn't require that just it's useless time of doing stuff so that we can focus and use the big brains that we have onto the problems that really matter.
Okay, well, busted. I think it's unanimous. It's busted. So that is our final myth. We do have let's call it 5 minutes left here. I'd love any comments or questions from the audience. I think we would love to hear from everybody.
Well, while we're waiting for those to roll in, there was something that I wanted to return to. There were some questions on generating your own threat intelligence and consumption of IOC feeds, and what does that really mean? Does XDR add the relevance, or is it just matching indicators? Look, is local intelligence important, right? There's the global perspective. There's a whole bunch of attacks out there, and when colonial pipelines happen, dark side, then everybody started to worry about it. But some of the threat telemetry that we saw, for example, was that DarkSide actually had a very small prevalence factor. And there were other ransomware threats that were orders of magnitude much more prevalent on a global scale or even a local regional scale across North America. And so, you never want to take your eyes off the off the prize, but at the same time, you need to use that intelligence capability to be able to understand what is the local relevance to me. And that's a global perspective, plus those things that you do locally. Those two really have to come together. And I think that's part of the place where XDR helps. Is it a SIM? Well, it helps with what you have done in SIM, but I think part of the uplift in value in XDR is a better analysis engine or layer that sits on top of some of that newer, more rich threat telemetry and intelligence coming together to give you better detections. And so, just a comment or a perspective on some of those things that were brought up around, threat intel and IOCs.
So Brian, I got to thank you for bringing up the butterfly in Australia for flapping its wings. So.
Yeah, exactly.
Just looking back through the questions, Kyle had a kind of a common question, like, how do we standardize a response? And I don't think there is one answer. I think that is going to be unique to every organization. I mean, come on, we all understand there's some, common things. If you're getting hammered by an IP address, you could block an IP. If you've got a bad domain that keeps attacking, you can block a domain. But I think when it comes to the more complex attacks, it really depends on the security controls in your environment and where you have the ability to implement blocking or additional detection. And so I think that is part of the reason why XDR on the response and even SOAR to an extent are very tailored to every organization, because this is the one case where everybody is a little bit more unique. You get these standard playbooks and standard response things from other folks, but if you're missing half of those abilities to implement those actions on those types of devices, we have to find what's relevant for you. And so I don't know that there ever will be a standard.
Yeah.
C2 beaconing response to block a domain. Sorry, the last thing I'll say there is you can, but you also have to appreciate that in a lot of attacks, some of the C2 command and control systems can move around faster than you realize. And so blocking one C2 IP or domain can change in a very short period. And so just as much as you have the ability to put that in, you have to have an ability to understand when it's no longer being utilized as an attack, attack source, and pivot to not only release that one, but look to see where else it's coming from.
Yeah. Or threat actors who are leveraging existing and well-known domains for C2 activity, and you start blocking them, and then you start getting yourself into other challenges, right? Other problems.
All right, guys, we're pretty much out of time here. So, anyways, I just want to thank all the B-Sides B-Sides members for joining our session today. If you have any questions, comments, feel free to reach out to Brian, Richie, George, or myself. We'd love to hear from you and further the conversation. $100 gift card. We will let you guys know. We're going to get together as a panel and vote on who the best, the most engaging audience participant was, and we'll reach out to you and make sure you guys get that GC. So thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.